Hello, readers. This is Justin's 52 Books, where I discuss my selections for the 52 Book Club's 2023 Reading Challenge. And I'm doing something special this year. I am reading only science fiction written by women for the Reading Challenge. Wanted to explore the legacy of women's authorship of science fiction with my Reading Challenge. This is week 7, and I'm talking about Prompt 7, a book with a city or country name in the title. My selection for that prompt was Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators Revolution, written by R.F. Kuang and published in 2022, just last year, actually just a couple months ago, because it was towards the back half of 2022 that it was put out. Straightforward and simple prompt that doesn't need much discussion or dissection, other than noting that when I first was looking at using Babel for the prompt, I actually had to go back to, I went to Genesis to actually make sure that I understood what the Tower of Babel was in reference to, if it was indeed a reference to a specific city. It's assumed that it is, and we're just going to go with that. Ideas of Babylon or something else, but yeah, we're going to go with Babel. It's weird to be talking about a new book. So far this year, most of the books I've been reading and discussing have been kind of fading into obscurity, but this is kind of the first new one, new book that's widely read, and widely read right now. Like, there's a lot of people who are reading this book, and it's kind of an author who's kind of having her moment. So, new spot for me to be in, and we'll see how that goes. Babel takes us through the journey of Robin Swift, a Chinese boy who is brought to England during the height of the empire, the English Empire, and brought up to be a translator for England and her interests. We see him as a boy under the thumb of his benefactor, the Oxford educator Richard Lovell. We then see him grow into an Oxford student, where we meet the real star of the book, the Royal Institute of Translation at Oxford, which is nicknamed Babel. It's at Babel where we find out about the magical properties of silver and how they are unleashed through the act of translation. It's the process of making a word in one language become a word in another language, and the transference of meaning between those two words that imbues silver with magic in Kuang's 19th century Britain. And thus Kuang has created a magical Britain that is running the English Empire through price controls of its magically enhanced silver. Cool, right? Not if you're China trying to stave off British influence and unfair trade deals involving opium imports. Not if you're a young translator from an imperially controlled area where you may be made to sell out your homeland in order to obtain the comforts and consolation of an Oxford education. And definitely not if you're in need of one of the services provided by Babel that you can't afford. Specifically, a service like healing, because the Institute assigns an inflated price to the magical silver supply in order to perpetuate demand. Revolution ensues. Some things I liked about the book, I love the writing and the unfolding of the book. I think it hits a lot of the marks that Kuang was aiming for. The main point of which is an anti-colonial low fantasy with lots of room to write about translation. And I love the bits about translation and the insights thereon. I've spoken about this before in other videos. I could just sit and listen to someone talk about a subject that they are an expert in all day. Whether it's a historic dress expert on her YouTube channel dissecting clothing authenticity in movies, or a Hall of Fame pitcher explaining the nuances of pitching strategy in Major League Baseball. I love it. I love hearing an expert talk about their subject. And that's what we have in Babel. Kuang is an expert in translation, or it certainly feels that way to me. And I love that she puts that into her story, along with the anti-colonialist themes. Also, there's a bit near the end that really tells the story of capitalism eating itself, where there's a dig at what we would now call planned obsolescence. The Royal Institute actually has planned obsolescence for the silver so that people keep coming back for their services, and that bites them in the end and brings down a couple of structures. I'm not going to say what, but it's pretty important to the story at the end, and I love that nod towards just naming planned obsolescence for what it is. Like I said, where Kuang was aiming, she hit, and she hit really well. The parts of the book I liked, I loved. But there were some things that I struggled with. I really struggled with the idea of anyone from Oxford, Cambridge, Georgetown, or Yale, and in Kuang's case, all four, laying out the sins of the privileged in a walled-off higher educational society. And I'm not saying this because I don't think Kuang is aware of her privilege from being from these institutions. I just wonder if the admirers of this book are. We still have this myth of meritocracy when it comes to institutions with names like these, like Yale and Oxford and Harvard and whatever. But when I see them as statuses and means to set children up in a straight pipeline, literally from preschool age, to attend these institutions and thrive based off of their attendance there. Look around. If you look at Congress in my country, you see a bunch of Harvard-educated dum-dums on both sides. In Britain, Oxford-educated Brexity morons thumbing the controls of state. The elites are idiots playing games by rules most of us aren't even aware are out there, if they are actually even rules to begin with. And 9 times out of 10, they are given those abilities based off of generational wealth. 9 times out of 10. And one of the perpetuators of that are these institutions. I think Kuang is aware of this. Hell, I bet she sees this firsthand. And so she probably knows more about it than I do. And yet here I am, having just read a book about the dangers of great education when it is held by the privileged few, written by one of those privileged few, saying that I have to acknowledge my own privilege, being a white male born in the United States. I recognize that privilege. I get that, what comes with this legacy. I'm not trying to compare the size or costs of Kuang and our privilege. I'm just saying that I struggle with accepting the moral clarity envisaged in this book. Another and somewhat lesser thing I struggle with in Babel is towards the end, where it feels like Kuang is making major arguments in favor of the great man theory of history, where Robin Swift understands that sometimes one man with an idea can change the world with one action. I'm not a fan of this thinking, and I'm not a fan of it pretty much since I ever read Dune, Dune's sequels. And I don't know if necessarily Kuang is either, but here again, it's a pretty moralistic tone that I feel the book takes. And I feel that needs discussion rather than blind acceptance. I'm happy to have that discussion, doing it right now. And I want to tangle with these ideas. I just hope everyone else is ready to tangle with them too. I assume that everyone is, but it's worth talking and worth bringing up. So ultimately, am I glad I spent the time with this book or not? I definitely am. But the book gave me some issues I need to tangle with. And like I said, I'm not afraid to do that. I just am not exactly sure I know how I feel about the book yet. Inevitably, book people like me, when having difficulty describing books, we fall back on the title meets title descriptions, and they're kind of hackneyed, like, the book was like Star Wars meets Pride and Prejudice, and that kind of thing. I try not to do that too much because I feel like it diminishes not one but 3 different books into smaller ideas than they may deserve to be whittled down into. But as I said earlier, Babel is a new book. It's a big book, not only in pages and content, but in notoriety as well. I just saw R.F. Kuang written about in the New York Times. And with that, I feel like I'm justified in simplifying everything down into an item meets item idea. I'm not going to justify it. I'm not going to explain it. And I'm just going to say it. Babel to me was Harry Potter meets Uncle Tom's Cabin. Other books that I would recommend for this prompt, if you were interested in assigning a book to the category of city or country in the title, well, you could always go the most basic route, which would be The City and the City by China Miéville. Great kind of mashup of weird fiction, which China Miéville is known for, and police procedural. Love that book. Love what it had to say about unseeing things. And then another great book by science fiction written by a woman, China Mountain Zhang. I'd be reading this one if I hadn't actually read it just a couple of years ago, by Maureen McHugh. Lovely book. Near future, so normal that it kind of tricks you into being just regular fiction, but which is hard for science fiction to do. But great book, great story, very very much a book I'd like to raise up into a little bit higher notoriety because I think it deserves it. On the science fiction side, I'd like to bring up any space station book would apply to this as well. Persephone Station, Barbary Station. Generational ships are, to me, cities that are floating through space. So Numenon by Marina Lostetter, or Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson. Or when going back to the space stations, the grandmother of all space station books, Down Below Station by C.J. Cherryh. Love that book. Can't recommend that more highly. And then if that's the grandmother, then the grandfather would be Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. Love that book. Lovely, just way out of this earth, literally, ideas in that book. Another left field idea for a city name for a science fiction book, whether you want to call it science fiction or not, would be the original Utopia by Sir Thomas More. That's a city, and any chance we get to discuss these things that are in our common lexicon, like utopia or apocalypse, these are words that come to us through books, and it's worth looking at what those books actually mean. And if you're looking at utopia, you can look at that all the way and get to another science fiction book written by a woman with The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is a short story, but you can read the short stories of Le Guin and you'd be right up in there. Very interesting take on utopia and a lot to do and say with that book. There's lots of discussion to have because of that book. So, on a nonfiction side, there's Beyond the Shoulders of Giants, My Journey Through the Harlem Renaissance by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Jabbar is an interesting writer, just an interesting take and flavor that he writes towards when he's writing, particularly his nonfiction. I pick up a Jabbar book whenever I can find one. And then two more, Nigerians in Space, which sounds like a science fiction book. It really isn't. It's more about brain drain, African brain drain specifically, by DJ Bryce Alukitan. Really like that book. And the last I'll mention is by my favorite author, Charles Portis, Masters of Atlantis. Not science fiction at all, but it does kind of touch on secret societies of the 50s. And you get to choose whether Atlantis is a city name or not, if you would like to. And that's it. Thanks for watching me talk about Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an arcane history of the Oxford Translators Revolution. This has been week 7 of Justin's 52 Books, and I was talking about Prompt 7, a book with a city or country name in the title. For more information on the prompts of the 52 Book Club, you can check them out on their website, the52bookclub.com. You can also check them out on Goodreads and Facebook and Instagram. And you can also check me out on Goodreads and Storygraph and Instagram at Justin's 52 Books. Hope to see you next week for Prompt 8, a dystopia. And my dystopian book took place just a couple years ago in 2021, so I'm really excited to talk about it. Until then, happy reading.